Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, and what a treat we have in store for you today, because this week I was fortunate to travel to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and while there I met up with three of the best historians in Australian military history. That's Roger Lee, Karl James and Aaron Pegram. They all work at the War Memorial, they all do slightly different things there, and they've all got fantastic insights into history, into Australian history, into military history, into the work that the Australian War Memorial is doing. So it was a wonderful opportunity to sit down with all three of them and discuss a whole range of topics. We talked about their work at the War Memorial. We talked about the nature of remembrance in Australia today, particularly now that we're coming to the end of the centenaries of the First World War. We talked about a whole range of topics. It was a really wonderful discussion. I think you'll really enjoy it, and I'm really pleased that I can bring it to you. So now let's hear from Aaron, Karl and Roger from the Australian War Memorial.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack.
This was their finest hour.
So we're here at the Australian War Memorial, and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. It's almost like a poker table with us all here sitting around. So why don't we do it that way. We'll take it in turns to introduce ourselves. So Aaron, why don't you kick it off?
Hello, Matt. Thank you very much for being here at the War Memorial and for taking the time to come and talk to us. My name is Aaron Pegram. I'm a senior historian in the military history section here at the Australian War Memorial. I think this is my third time on the podcast. You're probably sick and tired. Either sick and tired of me, or sort of lured back by my dulcet tones.
Yeah, no, I got to say the opposite, because we are. This is as far as my podcast is concerned, this is the dream team, because sitting around at this table, we have, the people that have done at least the top 5 or 6 podcasts of the total downloads are here. So that's why it was great to get you all together. Thanks, Aaron. Next over here we have
Dr. Karl James, and I'm a historian here at the Australian War Memorial. I've been here for nearly 13 years now, mainly working on Australia's experience during the Second World War, and I'm very happy to say that this is really my only grown-up job I've ever had or possibly will have. Yeah,
you are World War II is your bread and butter, is it? That's your area of expertise. That's where you're called on to provide information.
Yeah, certainly most of the time. So the bulk of my research and writing has been revolved around Australia's experience during the Second World War, but I also curated the exhibition From the Shadows, the history of Australia's Special Operation Forces. So while most of us here at the War Memorial will have one specialty, we all dabble in multiple conflicts and have our own sort of sub-units or sub-areas of expertise and specialisation.
Excellent. And sitting next to you, Roger Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's nice to be part of it again. I'm Roger Lee. For 20 years I was the Army's historian, but 2 years ago the War Memorial offered me fame and fortune and tempted me away, and I'm now the author of the official history of Australia's military operations in the war in Iraq 2003-2011. Although it's a bit odd because I'm a First World War historian and I'm struggling to come to terms with all this modern technology and stuff. But yeah, the politics are the same. So
this isn't even the topic that we want to talk about, but you've touched on it, so I'd like to discuss it a little bit. It strikes me that from my layman's position that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, because there were so many special forces involved, because of the nature of that war, I don't think Australia knows much about what actually went on there. How are you finding it trying to write this official history and, negotiating secrecy, special forces, restrictions? Are you going to be able to tell this story in a way that will, be meaningful to Australians?
Well, I certainly hope so. We've certainly accumulated a mountain of paper and electronic stuff. Yeah, you're right. It is a bit of a challenge. That old joke about if it's a question between a cock-up and conspiracy, then go with a cock-up every time. And it's pretty true in relation to this. One of the problems we're having, of course, is that the huge organisations like the Department of Defence and to a lesser extent Foreign Affairs and PM&C have got so many records. They're just trying to sort through them and sort out and get access to them. A lot of them are still, a lot of the operations, say in Iraq, are still current. So a lot of the files are still open. So they're a bit hesitant to give us access to it. To give them their due, I think most of the big institutions are trying to do the right thing. There are a few issues with that, but on the whole, they're trying to do the right thing. At the end of the day, our manuscripts, even though we're writing as independent official historians, our manuscripts are still subject to being cleared by all of these institutions, so we don't inadvertently, betray intelligence material or operational stuff that's still classified. But apart from that, most people, the best thing about it is we get to talk to some really interesting people.
Are you finding that you speak to people and they tell some great story, you go, oh, this is going to be great, but then you get the rubber stamp that says, no, you can't talk about this?
Not quite that yet. What I get at the moment is I talk to some people who tell me the really great stories, and I say, great, so I'll go and pull the official record, his post-activity report or his operations report or his diaries or whatever, and they can't be found. Or if they can be found, they're not being cleared for us to look at them yet. So I've got the individual who was there, who wrote the documents, who's told me what's in them, but I can't get access to the official final document because it's going through the clearance process, or they can't locate it, or whatever else. A lot of it's just they can't locate it. There are literally thousands and thousands of files. There are gigabytes of files.
What about the fact that it's still ongoing? As you mentioned, the campaign is still ongoing. Are you going to write volume 1, then look at volume 2 and 3?
No,
Are you going to write volume 1 and then come back and revise it every 5 years?
I'm writing volume 1, then I'm going to retire into obscurity. In fact, there are some days during the week now where I'd like to retire into obscurity right now. But no, I'm writing from 2003 to 2011, which is when we pulled the last Australian military out of Iraq before we went back in again. But everybody left in 2000, but had left by 2011.
I can't wait to. When are we going to see something published?
I can give no warranties or guarantees. The problem is it has to go through a clearance process, and also we're running behind time because of the problems with records. Originally I was contracted to deliver 300,000 words as the final draft manuscript on the 30th of June 2021. But because of the hassles with the records, we've been told we can extend to December 2022, which will make me a very old man. They'll have to widen the door to get my wheelchair and my oxygen bottle in. But I suspect we're going to use every minute of that. The problem is it's a small war in the sense that there's not a large number of Australians involved. My problem, of course, is that in Iraq, I've got such a long period and I've got one volume. In Afghanistan, which runs from 2000 to 2015, we've got 3 authors writing on that. They've broken it into 3 5-year slots. So that's, in a sense, that's good. They've got a lot of records to get over, but they've got a shorter period. And the other 2 volumes are, of course, East Timor, with the first volume being particularly about the invasion and pre-invasion, and the second volume, everything past the end of Interfet up to when we finally leave. And that's now been broken into 2 subparts. It'll be published as 1 volume, but there are 2 younger historians who've been brought in to write that, which is really good, Andrew Richardson and Will Westerman.
Great.
It's quite a big project.
I can't wait to see all of them. It's going to be fantastic. I don't know anything about it, and I'm in a space where I feel like I should, and I feel very limited in my knowledge about what went on.
Well, we are locked away downstairs. That's one of the conditions under which Defence and the intelligence agencies would give us access to the records in the first place. We all have to be security cleared and all that kind of stuff. Despite all that, we still don't have much access to any of those records, but it does interfere with our ability to interact with my colleagues up here. We don't come up here too often. We're locked away. But it's a big... the upside of this, of course, this is the first time in the history of Australian official histories that it's been very well resourced. We are well resourced. We've got a travel vote. We can go and... Rhys Crawley, the author of the second volume on Afghanistan, has been to NATO headquarters. He's been in the US. He's been to the UK interviewing people. And people are very generous with their time. He's been speaking to full generals in the UK who are running aspects of NATO's operations.
That's why I can't pin him down and get him on the podcast.
Absolutely.
Every time
he's never here.
He's always away.
Yeah,
he's got
always
lots of good stuff. I want to, I know he's doing all this new stuff, and I want to go old school and talk all about his logistics at Gallipoli, but he can't find the time. He's a busy man.
He is a busy man. He runs the liaison with Defence on the access of records at the moment, so he's also an incredibly frustrated man. So,
well, hang in there. It's great work you're doing, and it took Bean 20 odd years to write the official history of the First World War. So,
I hope we don't take that long. I'll be dead. But,
he had an easier job in many respects, but hang in there.
Yeah, He, I don't know whether he did have an easier job, actually. My respect for the official historians just gets bigger every day when I realise what David Horner always says, the art of being a historian is knowing what to leave out. And that's a hell of a problem when you get so much material that we've got. And I've only got 300,000 words to tell nearly 10 years worth of history. It's not easy, especially as you've got to give context. If I was writing for an audience that understands Australia's military and understands Australia's political structures, I could probably keep it much more focused and a lot tighter. But you can't. You can't assume anything. You can't assume prior knowledge. So trying to explain, there's a great quote I use in one of the chapters that says, explaining, historians for the next 100 years will be attempting to explain why on earth the US invaded a country which presented no realistic threat to its interests. And I could almost say the same for Australia. At this stage, I'm still struggling to understand why the hell we went there.
Well, even unravelling that major component of the war is, I can imagine, is a taxing experience.
Yeah, and the key players like the Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, I've interviewed him now. He was very open. He was very honest, as much as, I guess, any former politician can be. He's a charming man, very pleasant. But I could never get the definitive one-liner from him as to why we did it.
Do you feel a burden? Because you're writing the official history and it's the tradition of writing the first word, is there a bit of a burden to... And because you're also writing to a tradition, say, with Bean and Gavin Long.
It's some esteemed company you're in.
It is, and it's pretty scary. I've tried to model what I was doing on what Bob O'Neill did for Korea, but that's not working either. I do feel a lot of that. The only thing that drives me now is my only guarantee is it's got to be accurate. I've got to be able to hang it on evidence, because there's so much mythology about Iraq now, and so much of it's locked away, that this is going to be the first statement about what... I mean, for example, as you said quite rightly at the beginning, there's very little knowledge about what Australia did in this war, and I've just finished the early drafts of 2 chapters on the SAS, and what those kids, and they mostly were kids, did in that Western Desert between the 19th of March and about the 10th, 12th of April is outstanding. It's amazing. And I would say 99% of Australians have no idea what they did. And it's just a brilliant story. It was going to be 1 chapter. It's now going to be 3. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, the story itself is so brilliant. And the second thing is they've all been good to me, the guys I've interviewed who were there, and they've given me their diaries. They've given me the stories. So it's not really at the operational level, where this book is supposed to be. This is really into the tactical level. But I think it with special forces, particularly in the Western Desert, you can't separate the strategic, operational and tactical that clearly. They were in there to stop theatre-launched ballistic missiles from bringing Israel into the war and destabilising the coalition, and they did a superb job. And in doing so, they routed the Iraqis in the desert.
Wow, it's exciting stuff.
About 70 men.
Incredible! I can't wait to read it. I'm looking forward.
Well, those 2 chapters are good. Having read those, because basically all I did was steal the diaries of the guys that wrote them. You can't improve on what these guys who were there, how they said it, and they're all modest. It's you stop and read the words and you realise what they did, and you say to yourself, "Wow!" And these are young Australian kids who are also goofing off. They also have some highly inappropriate things in it, which I've put back into the book, which probably get taken out, but I enjoy it. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, it's great stuff. I think we should have a dedicated podcast when you can speak about maybe further down the track. We should sit down and talk about it. So I'd love to dig into it a little bit further.
Well, you should get all of us up here. Craig would be the best one. Craig, I said I followed Bob O'Neill. Well, the Bob O'Neill of this project is Craig Stockings, who's the official historian. The rest of us just, hack authors who are dragged in to produce words. But Craig's the one.
You're far too modest, Roger, but we'll definitely do that. That would be fantastic. So to listeners out there, tune in for the definitive Roger Lee account.
No. It might be modest, mate, but Craig's the one who's had to do all the fighting. Craig's the one who has to go into bat about records that are not coming through, about people who are trying to constrain what the project does. Even to defend the project, there were senior bureaucrats out there early stages of this who tried to kill it. And it was Craig who had to fight to defend it. And it's Craig who sets the standards. He's the one who says, because he said to me, he's had a look at a couple of draft chapters, and that's too boring. Make it more human. Put some of your own personality into it. I was writing it a bit like a staff paper. 20 years in the military, a bit like a staff paper. And he said, no, it's still a history. It might be official history, but still a history. So he's instrumental in the standard, and I take my hat off to him. I wouldn't have done it. I didn't bother applying for the job, and I wouldn't have taken it if they'd offered it to me, and he did. So.
Well, it's great stuff. I mean, and the work you're doing, I think, dovetails nicely with the broader topic that I wanted to discuss with you all today.
Yeah, sorry,
which is,
didn't mean to take over.
Please, no. This is why we're here. I mean, this is a fantastic opportunity to get some of Australia's leading historians around the table to talk about these things. It's brilliant stuff. But it does lead nicely into this broad discussion. We're late into 2018 now. We're coming to the end of the centenary period, and I've spoken to each of you over this period about various aspects of remembrance, and Karl obviously more of a focus on World War II, but Aaron and Roger, both of you did excellent podcasts about remembrance and battles that have been important during the centenaries. And really, I'm just fascinated to get your opinions about it, particularly since you work in one of the leading institutions for remembrance of military history in the world. I mean, everyone would agree with that. The Australian War Memorial does it better than just about anyone. So I wanted to dig into this topic a little bit and get your impressions about the 4 years, to get your impressions about the way that we remember, why we remember, and a whole host of ideas about that. I might start with you, Aaron, because you did a wonderful presentation at the Australian War Memorial, which was slightly controversial, about the Battle of Hamel.
Yeah, I mean, Hamel is certainly a very significant action fought by the Australia Corps on the Western Front under the command of Lieutenant General Sir John Monash. And I think one of the positive outcomes of the First World War centenary is that we started in 2014, okay, and people were building up. The big pressure moment was 25th of April. Everyone was looking forward to the centenary of the Gallipoli landings. And we had, on the centenary of Anzac Day in 2015, close to 120,000 people turn out to the War Memorial.
Wow.
I mean, that was certainly very significant. But I think what we've done throughout the First World War centenary is actually turn a light on what the Australians achieved on the Western Front. It's where the vast majority of Australian forces were committed during the First World War. It's where the AIF played a very leading role, a very significant role in the ultimate victory that was achieved by the British Empire and the rest of the Allied forces against Imperial Germany in 1918. And it's also where Australia suffered its greatest losses. Of the 60,000 Australians whose names are listed on the Roll of Honour as having died during the First World War, 44,000 of them were lost on the Western Front. I mean, the Australian public has now got a better understanding of the fighting in France and Belgium and what it all meant than, say, 10 years ago. I think that's a very significant outcome. I think perhaps in some respects the pendulum may have actually swung too far in that direction. And Hamel's a really good example. Throughout the First World War centenary, we've been looking at commemorating key moments in the Australian combat experience on the Western Front between 1916 and 1918, starting off with Fromelles, Pozières, Mouquet Farm, the Somme Winter, fighting at Flers and Goudecourt, Bullecourt, Messines, Passchendaele. But Hamel was this kind of real big turning point, because up until that point, more broadly, the story of Australians on the Western Front have been one of tragedy. It's very difficult to actually talk about those actions and not come away with the staggering losses. At Fromelles, 5,000 casualties in one night. Pozières and Mouquet Farm, 23,000 casualties. So Hamel, we start talking about the victories on the Western Front, this kind of evolution in the way in which the British Expeditionary Force as a whole fought and were very successful engaging the German army. Hamel, which is fought on the 4th of July 1918, is the first major operation carried out by the British Expeditionary Force since the end of the fighting since Cambrai, November 1917. It was a very stunning victory. It just happens to occur also under the command of Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, who's a very impressive senior commander. He's an Australian. He's commanding the Australia Corps. The 5 Australian infantry divisions are all united under his command for the very first time in this conflict, and it's a raging success. Now, my question was, is that success attributed to Monash? Something you've had Peter Fitzsimons on your podcast before, and he'd very much say yes. Monash was the best thing since sliced bread. invented the longer-lasting light bulb, perhaps. But, I wanted to take a more balanced view with what I did with Hamel and use the centenary to sort of challenge some of the myths that we know about Hamel and perhaps the Australian contribution to the fighting in the Great War, and challenge some of those. And as you said, it was a little bit controversial.
I want to touch on that point. I want to throw this open to everyone. Hamel is a fantastic example. And let me preface this by saying you don't want to take anything away from what the Australians achieved. I guess my question is, Hamel's a great example of us saying, we won the war. It exemplifies everything about perhaps Australian exaggeration about what we achieved in 1918. Why do we do it as Australians? What is it that compels us to take these incidents and to compare them to what else was going on and saying we did better? This competitive nature to say we were better than your forces, to perhaps blow them out of proportion. Why? What do you think it says about us that there seems to be this compulsion to turn these important actions into really big stories?
Before Roger kicks off, and I know he's going to, I'm going to get in. When Australia went to war in 1914, we were very much part of the British Empire. Australians in 1914 saw themselves as Britons. When we went to war, when Britain declared war on Germany owing to the German invasion of neutral Belgium, Australians saw this was the just thing to do. There was a German invasion force steaming through its way down through Europe, 250 kilometres away from England. It was a very deliberate threat to the British Empire. About 20% of the Australian population, correct me if I'm wrong, was probably, had significant ties to Britain. I don't know what the British-born percentage of the Australian population was at that time, but certainly there were significant familial ties to Britain. Many of the Australians, were very much united under the Union Jack, more so than the Australian flag. But by the end of the war, there was something a bit different. We saw ourselves a little different to the way that we did in 1914. It's something perhaps distinctly Australian. Earlier on in the war, we looked to the British Army as the veritable rock gods. These were soldiers that had been fighting wars for time immemorial and bringing victory to the British Empire. But Australians, by 1918, saw themselves not as equals, but probably better than.
So do you think that this idea of us highlighting Australian achievement, perhaps over-stressing what we'd done, began, from the end of the war?
Perhaps. What the Australian Imperial Force did was quite significant. But we certainly saw ourselves evolve, not as the sort of the children of Britain, or sort of the sort of poor little dominion of the British Empire, but certainly equal to. And I think with that comes through the combat experience a competitive nature. Certainly the troops felt that way. They saw themselves as probably being a bit competitive, this division against that. And perhaps as time has gone on, I think perhaps that's sort of grown out of proportion a little bit, to the point where historically the Australian historiography has made drawing too long a bow, where we've probably forgotten that the Australian Imperial Force was essentially part of the British Expeditionary Force. We all received the same training, we all received the same kit and equipment. It all came down to the commanders and units that were the commanders themselves, and the national distinction of the men that made themselves different from the British soldiers fighting alongside them.
Well, it's a great point as well. The isolation of those 5 divisions that were fighting probably exacerbates this, that we only look at the 5 Australian divisions. I'm sure if we took 5 British divisions or 5 French divisions and followed what they did throughout 1918, we'd also find these great stories of achievement, etc. But we look at the Australians in isolation, and it is difficult. It's a big war. It is difficult to look at 60 divisions across the British Army and determine where your role is in that place. Roger, I know you've got a few. Oh, Karl, you've got something to add?
I just raised my hand. But I think that question of audience is really important, because if you think about, say, the landing at Gallipoli or Hamel, they are actions that are easily identifiable as Australian actions, and they're actions that are important for an Australian audience. So you have people, and this is very much in the Australian context, we look into, say, the First World War, 60 divisions on the Western Front within the sort of the British Expeditionary Force, 4 years of horrific fighting. Where do you pull out those Australian stories? So sometimes you can look at, say, Villers-Bretonneux or Hamel or the landing at Gallipoli, and they're nicely defined actions where it's a largely Australian story, which then speaks to an Australian audience. I think it's part of the reason, if we're considering commemorating and remembering the Second World War, why now Kokoda is a stronger story than, say, Tobruk or El Alamein. El Alamein is one of the key moments, the key battles and actions fought during the Second World War. But there you have British Dominion and Imperial forces fighting side by side. The 9th Australian Division is key, but its actions get swallowed up in this much wider Imperial British story, whereas Kokoda, strongly Australian story, and you also have that connection too between Australian perceptions of Australian values. That's probably today more important than what soldiers may or may not did or how they performed, but it's what did it mean? What's your emotional response to it? It's that sense of courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice, your Larrick and Digger, that sense of humour, those values and those attributes, people are recognisable. You can see those traits, you hook into those, and that's so if you're looking for certain things, you'll find certain things. And I think in Australia we do a really good job of looking back into our historic past and to pull out and to see or to imagine what it is we want to see.
And I don't necessarily think it's a terrible thing. I think we should be very proud. I don't want to give anyone the impression here that I don't rate the Aussies. I'm, from the time I could first read about them, I've been memorialising these guys myself, and I hold them on a very high pedestal. But it's because of that I get disappointed when, and no disrespect to Fitzsimons. I mean, I'm sure it's his publishers that put the subheading on his book that it was the battle that Hamel was the battle that changed the world, or whatever they put. But I get disappointed when I read that because it takes away from what was achieved. If you read that if you go in with the expectation that the Australian soldiers were all supermen who could do anything, you're doing them a disservice. It's not the truth. Not only is it not the truth, but you're downplaying what they achieved by overblowing it, if that makes sense. If you go in saying, the Aussies were better than everyone, they could do anything, they could defeat the Germans at any call, why do you even bother to want to read the history? It's no achievement to just be the best in the world. I mean, so as much as I hold them on high, I actually get disappointed to read things that overblow them and simplify it and turn them into two-dimensional caricatures. It's not necessary, and it takes away from the experience to me. Roger, I know you'll have some very good things to put in. Roger's just about trying to grab the microphone off the desk. So what have you got to say about this, Roger?
My first point would be that there is no difference between Australia and any other nationality in the way they tell their stories. So if you go to Canada, the Canadians were the best troops on the Western Front and won the war. If you go to New Zealand, they recognise one division. They can't do that, but they still claim, and I happen to agree with them, that they were probably man for man, probably the best fighting force, simply because of familiarity with each other and continuity. If you go to Newfoundland, they probably feel they are the most sacrificial. And then, of course, we forget the elephant in the room is anybody in the English-speaking world forgets that the French did most of the fighting. And as you know, I went to the funeral this morning of Elizabeth Greenhalgh. She was probably one of the best scholars at the moment in the English world on the French. And I remember having a conversation with Elizabeth about 3 years ago, and she said one of the problems for this is we Australians put up Hamel. The Brits put up 8th of August. The French put up a number of battles down, and don't forget the French always fought over 2/3 of the front line. The Brits never occupied more than about 25 to 30% of the front line. The French have a number of battles that the English-speaking world is unaware of, and things like the battles of Soissons and those sort of things.
And they were huge battles.
They were enormous battles in which the French performed brilliantly. And yet we say the Battle of Hamel is this turning point because we're pig ignorant about what the French did. And this is my fundamental problem. I'm happy for Australians to point to what Australians do and do well and praise it and say that's good, because it is. I hate it when people like Fitzsimons do that by dumping on the performance of others. And to the way he carries on about the Brits, there are about 10 British divisions who, like the Canadians and the Australians, were constantly being used as the strike divisions in the BEF in 17 and 18. The same divisions turn up in the same battles and perform very well all the time. Sometimes they break and run. Who wouldn't? It's a bit like the Australian 4th Division. Nearly breaks and runs, has a mutiny, all that sort of stuff. It's this denigrating the performance of your allies to make you look good. That's what really frustrates me about this. And it's the ignorance of people about what everybody else was doing. Now, it's very hard to get across what the French are doing. There's only a few books on it in English, and they're all good, but there's not a lot of the operational and tactical stuff. And my big plea is that we should try and read about what these other guys were doing in their language, and before we start getting too parochial and jingoistic about ourselves.
I agree entirely about how much we overlook the French, and we overlook the Americans in the First World War as well.
The Americans will tell you they won the war, and a lot of them do. I go to conferences in the States, and every one of them.
Social media just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, exactly.
The American opinion is that we couldn't get our acts together till they turned up, and that's a whole different story. But I think the French suffer. The poor old French in the First World War. I think they suffer from two problems. They suffer from the very well-known fact that they mutinied in 1917.
Well, and that's a gross overstatement, but anyway.
Exactly. And that they suffer from the caricature we have of them in the Second World War. I don't believe that in the general public that that most people, and this is not to insult people, it's just there's only so much capacity people have for knowledge, that the First World War is very coloured by the Second World War because there's so many similarities in the ground that it was fought, the enemies are the same, etc., etc. So a lot of and we grew up, our people our age grew up with their parents or grandparents telling them stories of the Second World War. So everything that we do in our collective memory when we think about warfare is coloured by the Second World War. And we have this perception, this unfair perception, that the French all cut and run at the first sign of a German in the Second World War. And I think that also then that reflects, we saw all the stuff at the start of the Iraq War, all the jokes, which were very funny, but not historically
cheese-eating
accurate.
surrender monkeys.
Yeah, the cheese-eating surrender monkeys, and why do they have trees on their streets so the Nazis can march in the shade, and all that sort of stuff. But it's not just about we take the situations that are occurring now, and then we play them back over centuries. So now we go back and say, well, the French have never had a military victory. That was a great joke. It actually did happen. If you typed in French military victories into Google, it came up with an error message saying, don't you mean French military defeats?
Which means they've forgotten all about Napoleon.
Exactly. So we have this we take a contemporary situation and then we
retrospectively apply.
We reinvent the history to reflect that. And I think that's what the French suffer from in the First World War, that we have this perception that the French just aren't good fighters. And so years of hard work and brilliant combat by the French are overshadowed because we don't think of the French as fighters. We think of the French in the English-speaking world as not good fighters. We think of the Australians as amazing fighters, and we think of the US Marine Corps as amazing fighters, and the Kiwis and the Canadians, and we have our preset notions. And then we look at the French and we go, the French aren't good fighters, so we disregard years of tough fighting. And as you say, they carried the load for a lot of the time on the Western Front.
And if I could go back to your original premise about Hamel, the other problem that I have with the Battle of Hamel, and we talk about it as an Australian victory, it's almost impossible. It's good that we can draw the Australians out, but the BEF was a whole. You didn't have groups within the BEF. You had the BEF as a whole. So when the Australians are attacking Hamel, they've got British tanks, they've got British aircraft, they've got British artillery, they've got British engineers all in support. They've got British logistics sustaining them. They've got all this kind of stuff. So if you tell the Australian story at Hamel, you forget all the enablers. You forget all this background stuff that's going on. So the Australian government deliberately makes our biggest contribution fighting soldiers. That's one reason why we have such a high casualty rate as a proportion of those engaged. And that's simply because the British government took on all that boring rubbish that's called logistics. And we had first-line logistics, and everything after that we drew on the British. So whether it was getting gravel to build your roads or getting food or getting ammunition or anything like that, the British supplied it. So to take, like some of our popular authors do, take the Australians out and say, we were better than the Brits. Well, in a sense, some of them, we weren't better than the Brits, but our divisions were quite competent in battle because they had a lot of practice and a lot of experience, but they couldn't have done it if the British didn't supply all this stuff that went with it. And that includes even combat enablers. I mean, the British artillery, we had 2 siege batteries that had a couple of big guns, but the really, really big guns were always British operated, or French operated in our support. And if you just focus on the Australians, you forget that context that makes the outcome understandable. I mean, Hamel would not have gone that way if the British tanks hadn't been there. It would have been the best way of proving that is to look at what happens at the end of 1918 when we've outstripped the logistics support, we've outstripped a lot of the tanks, we've left the heavy guns behind. It comes back to what it was basically at the beginning, an infantry-on-infantry battle. And that's when we sustain our highest casualties. That's when we have all sorts of problems because it comes down to and by this stage the German army is broken and we're still paying a high price in blood. So to try and break the BEF up into some sort of artificial components is to miss the story of how the BEF worked. And that's one of my biggest gripes with the way we look at this through this nationalistic lens. Would have been different if the Australians had gone there like we don't even do it now. I mean, when we go to Iraq, the first thing that happens is the logistics support. The first lesson is budget from your coalition partners. The second direction is if you can't get it from them, buy it locally. And the third direction is if you can't get it anywhere else, then and only then do you come back to Australia in the supply chain. So we've always done expeditionary warfare on the cheap. And the First World War was on the cheap because we didn't invest in all this sustaining logistics and supporting combat support stuff.
If there's with the general public, if there's a perception, perhaps a misunderstanding about Australia's role and this desire with popular history to exaggerate somewhat Australia's involvement in 1918 and throughout the First World War, what about at the official level? Because, for example, the Sir John Monash Centre has just opened at Villers-Bretonneux. And look, I'll
very impressive.
I'll go on the record and say I was very impressed with it, but I think it's in the wrong place. I think that museum should be here. It should be in Canberra or in Melbourne, where every day thousands of school children can go through there. I think it's a distraction on the battlefield. And the reason I say that is because it's very technology driven, and I know it's very popular. I know I'm on my own when I say this, but it's very technology driven, which comprises mostly of actors reenacting scenes from the battle, which is fine. People need the visuals, and I certainly understand that. But one thing that struck me about the reason I say distraction is one of the last screens that you see when you're in there is a sort of a moving montage of headstones coming up from the cemeteries with then the inscriptions nicely written in script above them. And when I was there was a bunch of people standing there looking up at that screen with tears streaming down their face because it was so emotional to read all these inscriptions on. And what I wanted to say is you're standing in a spot beneath the cemetery. If you want to read these and be really emotionally affected by them, go upstairs and walk the cemetery and actually read those headstones. I'm sure those people did after they left the centre. I'm sure they didn't just get on their bus and go home. But that just said to me that this institution and the $100 million that we spent on it would be wonderful at the Australian War Memorial, would be wonderful at the shrine in Melbourne. But I found it was a little bit of a distraction actually being on the battlefields. I mean, I don't want to lead your answers here, but I mean, have you all been there? What were your thoughts of the centre?
Yeah, my first visit was in April. It opened in April this year. It was in, when was it? June, July this year. For the Hamel Centenary. And, very impressive and a very amazing place to be. My personal opinion, though, is that I don't think we needed another museum dedicated to the Australians on the Western Front, because there is now museums at Fromelles, at Bullecourt. There's Australians are very well represented at places like Messines and at Ypres. And I mean, Villers-Bretonneux, there already was a museum dedicated to the Franco-Australian Museum at the school at Villers-Bretonneux. So I mean, I just a little bit lost as to what that museum, the Sir John Monash Centre, does over all the others. I mean, it's supposed to unite these other museums that are on the Australian commemorative trail on the Western Front, and does so quite effectively. Perhaps its greatest strength is talking about the operations themselves, what directions the Australians were taking, what were their objectives, whether they're successes or not, and they do so quite graphically and quite effectively. And, that's one of its major strengths. I also was sort of a bit puzzled, though, that of the title, the Sir John Monash Centre at Villers-Bretonneux, and this became painfully obvious during the unveiling, where the Australian Prime Minister was singing Sir John Monash's praises, during the fighting at Villers-Bretonneux, when in all reality, John Monash wasn't involved in the fighting at Villers-Bretonneux. In fact, he wasn't yet the Australia Corps commander. He was then still commanding the 3rd Division, which was north of the Somme River, nowhere near Villers-Bretonneux. So, I mean, I think there is perhaps the museum is well-intentioned and does a really good job at what it does. It perhaps does detract away from the cemetery upstairs and the Australian National Memorial somewhat. If there is any place that John Monash is deserving of having a memorial, it's not at Villers-Bretonneux. It's probably at Hamel or Amiens, down the road near Harbonnières. They're just my thoughts.
We shouldn't make this too World War I centric, because I'm interested in this whole nature of remembrance, and I also don't want this to be totally negative and just say that people get it wrong all the time, because it's not. It's important stuff. Karl, can I bring you in here to talk about, because in the midst of all these World War I centenaries, we're also in the middle of the 75th anniversary of the Second World War battles, which I think have been somewhat overshadowed, which is a little disappointing to me, because our experience with the 75th at Gallipoli, for example, was that this was the last time we could interact with veterans who were there. This, they're all in their late 90s or early 100s now by the time they get to the 75th anniversary. And Gallipoli was our farewell to these veterans, our last chance. And that was 1990 in Gallipoli was this moment where all the veterans came and they said their farewells to their mates and we said farewell to them. And after that, we started losing them very quickly. And soon there were none left. That should be what's happening now for the World War II battle. How do you feel the 75th commemorations are going for World War II? How do you feel that is there a difference in the way we remember the Second World War from what you've seen with the First World War centenaries?
Yeah, I think overall it's understandable and probably appropriate too that so much time has been spent commemorating Australia's involvement in the First World War. But they are coinciding with these other big anniversary periods. So this year, for example, is now the 75th anniversary of the, around about now, sort of September, October, the operations around Lae and the New Guinea Offensive. And the New Guinea Offensive in late 1943, which continued into early 1944, was the biggest military operations ever conducted by Australian military forces. Multiple squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force were involved, most of the ships of the Royal Australian Navy at some point, and both the AIF as well as the militia formations were heavily, heavily committed. Something like the equivalent of 5 infantry divisions. The New Guinea Offensive was massive. But have you heard about it? The way to take Salamala, Lae, Huon Peninsula, the Finschhafen, Saddleberg, we can rattle these names off, but they're hardly familiar. So we are in this point now where those bigger actions from 1943-44 are passing us by, and also too we are at the point where so much time, effort, money has probably been spent commemorating, say, the First World War or other actions, that the Second World War generation are passing away. So last year was the anniversary of Kokoda, the 1942 battles of Kokoda and Milne Bay, and just this year we've had at least 16 veterans from the Rats of Tobruk. So Tobruk was the siege of Tobruk in 1941, one of those key moments, a really important, strong story for Australians, key moment in the war in North Africa. At one point, the garrison consists of around 17,000 Australian soldiers, of a larger garrison of about 20 and 25 British and Dominion soldiers, and now we're down to probably hundreds, if not tens, of Rats of Tobruk. This year, as I mentioned before, 16 have passed away, and they're all in the late 90s, early hundreds, which is pretty impressive. But my personal fear and my concern is that over the next couple of years, the Second World War generation, particularly those men as well as women with the nurses who had that frontline combat experience, will pass away. And no one will really notice beyond, say, your immediate family members. So you've got this great generation who are still with us. And this now is our last time to ask those questions, to gather their experiences, and really just to honour their memory, to do it while they're still here. Because within the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they will have essentially all passed away. And from a personal point of view, while I can see why people commemorate and remember our war dead, so much of the commemoration around, say, the First World War and other big battles and commemorative events has been about remembering the fallen. We haven't really had conversations about the living. Yes, 62,000 Australians died during the First World War, but 200,000 came home. What did they do when they came back? The 500,000 Australians who served in the Second World War, what did they do? Well, they built modern Australia. So much of this commemoration and talking about remembering, what are we remembering? We're remembering the war dead. Yes, we need to remember those, but let's have that conversation about the people who came home, who got on with their lives, who struggled with PTS, or maybe they were disaffected, or maybe they just came back to Civvy Street, took their military experience and just got on with it. Because if they didn't do it, no one else is going to do it for them. So let's have some wider conversations, I think.
Well, this is a recurring issue, though, isn't it? Because we've seen this from every war from the First World War onwards, including Iraq and Afghanistan, that our focus becomes on the people that died, and we have, in the modern conflicts, and again, not taking obviously anything away from the people that sacrificed their lives in military service, but we've seen ramp ceremonies, etc., and we every Anzac Day we talk about the men who who died in Afghanistan, Iraq, but we seem to have this. As a society, we have this issue that we're very good at turning civilians into soldiers, but we're terrible at turning soldiers back into civilians. And we do seem to overlook as you say, the survivors, and focus on the dead. It seems to be not just the First World War, not just the Second World War. It seems to be an ongoing issue. Why do we think that is? That firstly, do you agree with that? And secondly, why is that? If you do, why is that the case?
I wouldn't actually agree with you that we're very good at turning civilians into soldiers. We seem to get an awful lot killed before we get it right.
Good point. Very good point.
We do that. We've done that in practically every war we've been to. It's because we underinvest in defence in times of peace, and I understand why, but we do. And I think it's the same problem in reverse. When we come out of war, everyone's so keen to get rid of it. We don't want to spend anything on it, so we don't invest enough in that transition period. We don't invest enough. We are now, thankfully, particularly with mental health issues, because we've been bitten by that dog, and we should have been.
We were slow to pick up on that,
but these are people who volunteered to serve their country. The country was happy to take their obligation when they were out there killing people on their behalf. But when they come back and they need help in reverse to transition back to what they were, the country seems reluctant to spend money on it. And I think we've done that throughout history. And I think that's
because
part of
it's
our
too
problem.
hard? Is it too hard to? Is it too big a problem?
I think the first problem is that when you get to the end of the war, don't forget the military always a very small part of society, even in a major war. I mean, yes, we talk about the size of the military in the Second World War. I think we had 1 million people in uniform.
Almost 1 in 7 people.
Yeah, so 1 in 7, which means 6 in 7 weren't. So as soon as the war's over, they want to get back to what life was like as they remember it. They don't want to be bothered with having to pay extra tax to look after these people. They want to get back to living a normal life. You can't blame them. They've been going through all this privation and restrictions on liberties and all that kind of stuff. They want life to become normal.
As probably did many of the soldiers themselves, the combatants themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely right. I'm the son of a Halifax pilot. He came back and went straight back to the farm. The Air Force would have offered him all sorts of things, but he didn't want to know about it. He just went straight back to the farm because the dairy farm needed labour, and one of his brothers was a copper who wouldn't be released, so he was released from the Air Force and went back to the farm. I suspect that's a very small but common story. They got out of the military, went straight back to work and disappeared. He never marched on Anzac Day. In fact, he didn't much like a lot of the people on Anzac Day marches. He said they were the rear echelons who never went put himself. That's my father's view, not mine. But I suspect that's a fairly common story throughout, and I suspect the same in the First World War. They just came back and got on. And also, the other problem, and this is a fairly, I think it's reasonably well known now in the repatriation story, that the repatriation commissioners after the war were not seen as doctors looking after the interests of the injured men. They were seen as agents of the Treasury looking after the national interest. And that's a fairly common story in a lot of the repatriation stories that you hear. It's perhaps a little unkind to them, but I think it's probably true. We didn't understand after the First and Second World War, I think as well as we do now, the full range of issues that can arise from combat. We just didn't do it. I mean, they were a different society. I mean, modern day kids don't see death. It's very rare. You don't have the old situation where great-granddad's laid out on the table in the front room, or that sort of thing. All you see is a closed coffin at a cremation or at a funeral service. And I think seeing people come back from war with arms and legs missing and eyes, and particularly those with those horrendous gas or facial. I mean, we should have Kerry Neal in here talking about the facial injuries and the sort of lives that those guys had. Society tended to push them one side, didn't know. So I don't think we do that transition very well at all. I don't think it's not a criticism. I just don't think we do it because I don't think we know how to do it. I think we're getting better at it, but we're not. Also, the other thing you have to say, of course, is that war is, despite the fact that the 20th century was such a bloody century, we don't do wars all that often. And I think we quickly forget, well, I know we quickly forget the lessons that we learn from wars. We have to learn them every time again.
See, I disagree a little bit because into, say, the 1920s and certainly by the 1930s, there's quite a large part of Australia's GDP, or what would now identify as a GDP, went into paying for war reparations and disabilities and repatriation, went to the repatriation. So the government actually invested quite a bit and invested more by comparison to, say, Britain and the United States and our other allies, and certainly much more than in other countries. I think that there was a limit as to how much the government could afford to pay for it, because leaving into the 1920s and the 30s, you have the Great Depression, a whole series of droughts. The country's not particularly flush with cash. So I think they certainly were mindful of it. And you see this during the Second World War, the way they tried to come up with army education, the slow means for repatriation. It wasn't a case of war's over, here's a demobilisation paper, see you later. They invested very heavily into training, preparing people for the post-war world, so you could get useful civilian skills, study at university. So there was an attempt to equip the military and service personnel for the post-war world. And you do see things such as the prisoner of war commissions and reports where they did interview people. There's a lot of sympathy for claimants. But the monetary itself, by comparison, was small, but they were trying to do it.
Karl, do you think they'd learnt lessons from the First World War? You know, the people that were the instigators of these programs were the veterans of the First World War. Had they learnt lessons from the First World War? Were they trying to avoid the problems that we saw?
Absolutely,
after the First World
absolutely, 100%. So the training, military training, the army training, for example, in their rehabilitation and training skills, and these are like carpentry, like trades. They're basically, you're an infantryman, so you know how to throw a grenade and use a brain gun and assault a pillbox. Now let's give you a trade, so you can become a carpenter, a fitter and turner, that type of thing. So
with some success, we should say. I mean, the
absolutely.
50s were quite a prosperous time.
There's so many stories of guys who came back from home, like back from Australia. There's a limitation on, you couldn't get trained qualifications and tradies, so they built their own home. They just went out, bought the lumber, had the block of land. They did get their deferred pay, so they could use it as a bit of a payment to put a deposit down and buy a piece of land. And they built their own house with their own hands. Likewise, too, with the soldier settlement schemes, the blocks that were given to soldiers to farm, they had learnt a lot from the failed experience in the First World War. In the Second World War, more training, more facilities, they were better funded. They had larger blocks of land to make the land more useful. So they'd certainly learnt a lot from it. And then generally, too, in the 50s, Australia and the West were more prosperous. So they had many advantages in that way. So I think they do learn.
Can I jump in and say I don't disagree with what you're saying. In fact, I quite agree. I hope I didn't give a total view. It's a very complex story. Another anecdote from my own family. My mum's a teacher, and she was going through teachers' college in 1946 to 48. And she had to line up behind all the ex-servicemen who were given preferential treatment into teachers' college to get ahead. And because she was a woman, back then it was okay. They didn't have enough teachers, so she still got in and went out. But the ex-soldiers always got the best postings, according to her. Again, I don't know how true this is because I've never studied it. But according to her, they were the ones that got to stay in Brisbane or stay in the Cape, whereas she had to go out bush, which is where she met my dad on the dairy farm because she was teaching at a one-teacher school. And that sort of story. It's a very complex story, and you can't generalise on it. And this is the mistake that I made earlier on in this discussion. You can't generalise on it. A bit like after the First World War. I mean, we had a very complicated system of training in Europe to look after all, because we didn't have enough ships to bring all the AIF back home quickly. We had to keep them entertained. So they sent you could go to university in Europe at the expense of the government. You could go and learn farming in Belgium. I don't quite understand the application of dairy farming in Belgium to go and work in growing wheat in the Wimmera, but nonetheless, that's what they did. You could do all these sorts of training, and an awful lot of our next generation of lawyers, doctors and whatever went through in the 20s and 30s, went through university in Britain, courtesy of the AIF education system. So, yeah, you're absolutely right, we did it. There's still the problem, though, and I accept what you say, we didn't do enough. But when we're at war, we seem to be able to find the money, but we don't seem to be able to find the money when we're at peace. And I guess that's always been my criticism of it. We went about it. There was a lot of good intention. There was a lot of effort and time put into it. But the longer you get away from the war too, the less there is that sense of emotional obligation to those who were there. So if you look at the 20s, at the beginning of the 20s, it was a boom period as well, so they could afford to be generous. But as Karl says, by the time the Depression starts to roll around, we are paying the pensions which we are legally obliged to pay. But I think a lot of the support mechanisms, the informal voluntary groups switch from looking after... I mean, we had a dreadful class of ex-soldiers who were the gas victims, and they were living in hospitals all around Australia. And there were a large number of them. They found them, actually, at the beginning of World War II when they cleared out the hospital at Manly at World War II to make room for the new casualties, they found about, I think it was 30 or 40, I don't remember, and I don't even know where I read this, gas victims from First World War who were still living every day in a saline bath. And they'd been there since the First World War, and everybody had forgotten about them. The medical system was looking after them, and they were fine, but, they were just there. I don't know where they went. I think they went to Alexandria. But, it's very hard. Society wants to move on. It doesn't want to look back. And young people coming through want to look on because they've got their lives in front of them. I fully understand that.
Well, it's pretty ghastly what we're talking about. I say this all the time when I lead a battlefield tour or I talk to anyone about the war. What we're talking about here is young men getting maimed and killed and their blood spilled all over the place. So it's pretty ghastly. So you can understand why societies do want to move on. I guess that we just have to try and learn that lesson not to leave them behind.
It's a bit harsh, but you actually get better remembered if you die rather than if you wish you were dead. And I always give the rough rule of thumb, about 1/6 of our volunteers in the First World War died. Another 1/6 of them came back to Australia and probably were living death. Collapsed lungs because of gas, facial injuries that met their pariahs, social pariahs, blind, whatever, couldn't get a job. About 1/6 of those.
Well, if you go to West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide, which I think is probably unique in Australia, which is effectively it looks like a Commonwealth War grave cemetery, but it's not. It's privately done or paid for by the people of Adelaide. For soldiers who'd served in the First World War and then died afterwards were still buried together in a military-style cemetery, and it's incredible. Like there's a couple of thousand buried there, including I think 4 VC winners. When you browse those headstones, unbelievable. The thing that strikes you is the number of how young they were, the number of people that died in the 20s and 30s, aged in their 30s or 40s, and the inscriptions from the families that say, firstly, so many of them at Keswick Hospital, which was the repatriation hospital, and also the number of inscriptions almost identical from families at peace finally after much suffering. It's a universal, just a universal comment from the families. And I tell you what, anyone who wants to get an insight into what life was like in Australia in the aftermath of the First World War, go and just walk those rows of that cemetery. There's just so much grieving and sadness and the loss of people, and young children leaving messages to their father, and there's almost an air of it of, well, we're sorry to see you go, but
thank heavens you're gone.
Yeah. It's just terrible stuff.
Well, a lot of them don't make the change. I mean, you look at some of the great icons. Charlie Singh comes back, can't make the transition to civilian life, becomes an alcoholic, eventually dies in some DOS house in Brisbane.
No, the suicides after the First World War. Barely, I know we talk about a lot about it today, which is obviously really important, and I'm very, very glad that we do. But I don't know if anyone's done a study into the number of First World War veterans and probably Second World War veterans, Karl, who committed suicide after they came home. We hear about it anecdotally. We see in the newspapers that there's, a man was found hanging from a tree. He had recently come back from France. You see those sorts of anecdotal suggestions that it was going on, but the numbers must be astounding of the men that didn't. We hear about, Throssell VC who committed suicide, Pompey Elliott. We hear about the famous people, but I think they must be representative of thousands that we don't.
A lot of the families, of course, didn't acknowledge that they'd committed suicide either, because we're a different generation, different time. Suicide was not acceptable to a lot of people. So I suspect even if you did do the statistical studies, they'd be underrepresented.
It'd be very hard because we could say, for example, will be looked through the coroner reports, but then you need to know a name to work backwards, or looking through historic newspapers. And as Roger said, some suicides were reported, many probably weren't. Sometimes you can kind of guess reading between the lines. And it's only really, Pompey Elliott was a different case because he was a well-known figure, and like the inquest into his death was reported as well. But that's...
He also had a known medical condition. He was bipolar, and he was before he went. So,
see, there's the nail on the head too. How much of that mental health condition can retrospectively be applied to war service? Because just because you've worn a uniform and you've gone through a horrible experience doesn't necessarily mean you come back and you've messed up. And psychological trauma and results in a suicide. There could be a whole myriad of different psychological conditions that may actually predate military service that could be attributable to the ultimate.
And between the wars, we had the Depression, we had financial hardship, we had broken homes, we had all sorts of external issues as well. You're right; it would be very difficult to pin it down to.
We're human beings. We're human beings. I mean, the classic one of the jobs I did in the Army History Unit was we used to do the research for admin appeals tribunals where people would sue Veterans Affairs to get a DVA pension because of war service illness. And I remember We had one case where this bloke claimed that his service in Vietnam had turned him into an alcoholic, and we pulled his army service record. Even before he joined the army, he was in and out the slammer for DUI and drunken, disorderly and aggressive behaviour. The army's mistake there was actually taking him in and sending him to Vietnam. It wasn't, we didn't turn him into an alcoholic. It was long before he got here, but we should never have, the army should never have taken him. Wouldn't do that now. But, I'm sure that's a same story. It's a bit like the army is represented, or the military are representative of the society it's in. So they get almost as many criminals as general in society. There are a number of Australians who don't come out of the First World War. You've only got to read some of Peter Stanley's books, come out of this with any honour or anything else. They didn't have any honour when they went in. So they're not going to develop it in that kind of environment. They're going to get worse. All it does is train them to be really good at what they want to be, which is a criminal.
Well, I say that as it's one of the things that I bring up with people as well, is that it's why we don't want to stereotype and turn them into two dimensions, because a military force, like any other large group of people, is a society in its own right, and within that society you're going to get good characters, you're going to get bad characters, you're going to get heroes, you're going to get cowards. Not cowards, you're going to get people that don't charge machine guns and win Victoria Crosses. You get a cross section of society, and we should acknowledge that. That's part of the story. I don't think there's any glory in covering that up and pretending it wasn't the case. It's just simply the case. To finish up, I just wanted to ask you all. You work every day in the field of remembrance. Your job is to make sure Australians don't forget, and whether it's with the War Memorial or the writing of official histories. What's the future of remembrance? We've now crossed. We're coming up to a milestone, November. So much of this is tied to the First World War. The building that we're sitting in is inherently linked to the First World War. So much of what we do, Anzac Day, Remembrance Day, so much is tied to the First World War. Is there going to be an interesting line now that we've crossed, now that those centenaries are out of the way? What's the future, from your chairs, what does the future of remembrance in Australia look like?
I think just going on from the conversation that we were just having, I think there's probably going to be a greater awareness of the diversity of the Australian military experience throughout the 20th century and beyond. Not just wedded to these key dates relating to battles fought on Gallipoli on the Western Front amongst the AIF. I think the Australian public hopefully switching on to the fact that there's over a centenary of military service. There's a lot to think about and to commemorate, and it doesn't we shouldn't stop remembering those men and women who have worn the uniform and served in the nation's interests once they come home. That's just me. Every time that I come to work, every day, there's always something new. I think I really should know more about that. Roger, I had no idea your father was a Halifax pilot. After this interview,
466 Squadron. Mate.
Oh, right. Wow.
Based out of Driffield.
Okay. Well, that's I really want to learn more about Bomber Command and the early periods of Bomber Command, for example, which as well, those veterans are they're dying at an alarming rate. I just like to. I think that the diversity of the Australian military experience itself is probably going to be greater acknowledged than just the key dates and key figures.
And that's really been a thread of this conversation. It's about getting away from stereotypes and asking new questions. At the moment, we're in this period of having large commemorative events. However, in many ways, a ceremony or a memorial can be a very passive form of remembrance. I always think it's much more exciting to be active in our commemoration, active in our reflecting on the past. How do you be active when you're taking a moment? Maybe it is just to take that one moment on Remembrance Day or Anzac Day and think of the diggers, think of the sense of family history, or a more exciting way, and a passionate way, and it's not just to do with remembering war service, but just history in general. Ask new questions, look into your family history, think outside of the box. What did the Australians do, say, alongside of the French? What were the experience of Australians serving with alongside the Americans in New Guinea, or say with the Brits in Europe? Ask new questions. Let's be active. Listen to podcasts, battlefield tours, read books, produce stuff. Join that conversation on social media. Moving forward, social media is this great platform where everyone can contribute to this conversation. Once upon a time, you had to be in a museum or an academic. You had to publish a book. Maybe you do a TV documentary. That was great, but it was limited to who could participate in this conversation and this shared discussion. Now with social media, Twitter, podcasts. Let's get out there, make more connections, ask new questions, and listen to each other.
I wholeheartedly agree with Karl, because I think asking new questions and having a broader discussion and debates about Australia's past, not necessarily just its military history, is going to make for a more nuanced attitude towards the past. The act of remembrance is active. It relies on more than just historians to be involved in doing it.
I've got slightly different thoughts. I've got a couple. I think once the centenary of World War II rolls around, I think commemoration and remembrance is going to be quite interesting when there are no grandparent or great-grandparent connections. So once the family connection becomes a bit more remote in time, I think that's going to be a challenge. The other big thing for me is the changing demography of Australia, where an awful lot more of the people in Australia now have no direct linkage back to these two major, shall we say, defining moments in our history. I mean, if you're like Gladys Berejiklian, who's a daughter of an Armenian, First World means something entirely different to her than it does to the Western Front. Not very nice. If you're from South America, where they basically came to the war at the end to share in the spoils, you have absolutely no emotional connection to the First World War. The other big thing is how far back and how long do you keep doing it? I mean, the UK doesn't think much about the Napoleonic Wars, but in a sense at that time the loss as a proportion of the population were probably not dissimilar. And the other thing, as wars get smaller and our military gets smaller and our military's involvement gets smaller, a smaller proportion of the population go. So most of the commemorations that will be done by people who have no connection to the military. So why are they doing it? What's the link that draws them to commemorate? And I think for institutions like this, they're going to have to constantly remind the Australian public that the reason this is important is because of how it set this nation up the way it is and made it the way it is. So the reason you're here now enjoying this nation in this shape and this form is because these people volunteered to go off and do it. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, of course. There's a lot. I mean, it shouldn't just be here then. The place across the lake, the museum to Parliament House, I think has an equal role to play in that. We are in a democracy. My favourite story is the English Civil War should be number one priority in study at school. And everyone says, why? Foreign country, long time ago. And I keep saying our whole parliamentary system of democracy and the fact that we don't have a dictatorial monarchy came about because they shortened Charlie the One by a head, and it came from then. And most people just look at you now like that's a stupid thing to say, but it's true. The structure and shape of our democracy basically came from back then.
Karl, Roger raises a really interesting point, and I want to direct it back to you as a curator. You're someone who's in charge of developing these exhibitions at an institution that was created so that the veterans themselves could be remembered, in their lifetimes, so the veterans could bring their families. And when we look at the dioramas were originally built, in my opinion, so that veterans could come and stand there with their wife and their children and explain what it was like to be at Pozieres or Lone Pine. How does an institution like this one, how as a museum, as a place of remembrance, and you as a curator, how does that work in the future when there is no connection? Because Roger's right, the wars are getting smaller. I mean, there's 50,000 people in the Defence Force now compared to the hundreds of thousands or close to 1 million we saw in the Second World War. Even if there is a war in the future, we're not personally going to be very touched by it in a genuine personal way. How does a museum like this go forward? How do we keep remembrance alive? Is it important to keep remembrance alive when we're losing that personal connection?
It's a very interesting question, and I think it's something which the War Memorial in the years to come is going to have to grapple with. The demographic of Australia in 2018 is very different to, say, 1918, and it will be different to what we will look like in 2038, for example. What that means from a practical point of view is that you can assume that the level of knowledge within the Australian community will be much smaller, probably zero. So once upon a time, with that Lone Pine diorama, that, as you mentioned, that was sculpted so the veterans could come here and talk to their children and their wives. And there was also a wider awareness, I think, of the conflict. So again, with the the World Wars, these were mass events. The Australian community as a whole was aware of what was happening, what took place. Compare that to, say, the war in Afghanistan. Yes, it's our longest involvement in Afghanistan. We've just ticked over 17 years. longest involvement, but also at least understood. So the next 5 to 10 years, how do you tell that story of Australia's involvement to Afghanistan, or Australia's involvement in Afghanistan to an Australian audience who don't know why our troops are there, what they did, but also too, thinking about who are Australians. We are now no longer sort of white Anglo-Saxon sort of Celtics, or from an Indigenous point of view, thinking about people who've come to Australia from lots of different countries. So if you're thinking about war and wartime commemoration, this is why I personally think we need to take a wider view and think about, well, let's look at it from the Vietnamese context. Let's look at the Americans, look at the British, look at, say, Africans, look at the experience of Afghan refugees and migrants to Australia, in addition to our members of the Australian Defence Force. We need to tell this. Do we need to tell the stories of our Afghan interpreters as well as our mentors? So there's some big questions to grapple. Personally, I feel the way forward is that we'll have to tell more of the contextual story, but then I think you'll probably also see it then drill down to more of the simple element of the emotional response. This is what it means. This is why you went to something. This is why you went to Afghanistan. This is why it's important, or this is why Gallipoli is still significant in the years to come. But they're big questions, and I think they still need to be answered. We still need to have that conversation.
And it doesn't just apply here in Australia, obviously, because, Roger, I know you and I have discussed this before. For how long into the future do the French think it's okay for acres of their countryside to be occupied by cemeteries to foreign forces? If France had, as many cemeteries from the Napoleonic Wars as they did from the First World War, I'm sure they would not be as well maintained as the First World War cemeteries are, or indeed they'd be disappearing now. So there must come a time in the future where, and it won't be soon, it will be many decades in the future, but there must come a time when French people start to say, do we really need thousands and thousands and thousands of individual graves to soldiers who died 150 years ago in our farm fields? Can we just collect them all together and put one big memorial up? Or, we don't want to say that it never happened, but can we gather them together or close them down? Or, we must these must be things that are that are coming in the future, which is sad to see, but also the realities of moving on. I think it's a fascinating time we're moving into. You're right, with both the dynamic of the changing Australian society and also the gradual loss of that personal connection. It will be very interesting to see where remembrance goes in the future, and if this is even important. I'll be very interested to see if in 20 years Anzac Day is still as popular as it is now, because it has in past generations, it has come and gone. It has been very cyclical. In very short periods of time, you can go from 10 years from where no one was going to Anzac Day to where everyone is going to Anzac Day.
Well, in that post-Vietnam period, we thought Anzac Day was dying. The original Anzac Day ceremonies at Anzac Cove were down on the point because there were only 50 or 100 people there. Now you've got thousands of people turning up. Interesting to see how many we get next year.
We could have well turned a corner now as well. We could have seen the peak in this time, and it could start to wane somewhat.
The other side of the coin too is your point about the cemeteries in France is valid. Look what happened when they tried to build the third Paris airfield, though, in the Somme Valley. There was such an outcry in the UK that the French government backed down. But they won't back down, I think, if things like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission doesn't maintain the cemeteries the way they are. So as long as the old British Commonwealth is prepared to keep funding the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to keep looking after the cemeteries, they may stay, because they do draw tourists. They do a lot of the locals get work there, so you can't take it out of the economy of the environment which you are. I suspect a lot of the small ones will eventually have to be consolidated. Those silly little ones you see out in the middle of the paddocks where the poor old farmer's got to move his multi-gang mowers and do these sharp right-hand turns around them. I suspect they'll be consolidated. But I think the future for the big ones, I think, will be a while. And the French, and particularly the Belgians, I'm surprised by how the young people over there still feel this sense of obligation to Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and sometimes to the British, for having come and saved them. Not once, but twice.
It's been a while since this has occurred, but my early days, 20 years ago, going to the Western Front, you couldn't go through the streets of Villers-Bretonneux without someone coming up and shaking your hand and giving you a big merci for being Australian and having saved their town, 60 years before I was even born.
I think the danger would be to assume that the levels and interest in war history and war commemoration of what we have today will remain at the same level, because, Roger's absolutely right. In the 70s and even 1980s, Anzac and Anzac Day were dead traditions. The tradition, though, evolved and changed, and there was this rise of family history, in addition to the 75th anniversary of Gallipoli, for example, corresponded with the rise of family history, corresponded with a range of other things to drive that interest. But we're one bad war away from wanting to remove ourselves from remembering war and remembering conflict. Alternatively, the other public debates that are occurring around, say, Australian history and Australia Day, for example, what may happen in the future is you have more of a merging of Australianness through war history and war commemoration. Maybe Anzac, because Anzac and Anzac Day has evolved, it could be that in the years to come, Anzac is more unifying than, say, Australia Day.
I think it's also interesting that what we've seen with Anzac Day, that it's almost like young people who are obviously now very engaged with Anzac Day have almost dragged their parents back into remembrance, that their parents who perhaps went through that period of post-Vietnam and not wanting to be involved in Anzac Day and seeing the effects of that war were then dragged back into commemoration by their children who, for whatever cultural, social reasons, really engaged with this Anzac history. And that might not happen again. That might be a once-off that means that this level of absolutely profound remembrance may not continue into the future. Do we have concluding comments? Anything we want to add to this before we wrap it up?
Oh, look, I think history there's no certainty to it. It's not something that you just open a textbook and read all about it. I mean, it's always shifting and evolving. And I think this conversation has really borne that out. So it does remain a little bit uncertain, but it's certainly very interesting to sort of wait and see what happens from here on in.
I worry that history, the way history is used and the way it's taught, I don't particularly like the way military history is taught at the moment in our schools, in the education departments. I had to go and give a talk to the Victorian History Teachers Association many years ago about one of Australia's great Australian myths, Simpson, and I polarised the group immediately into two halves, those who accepted the evidence I produced and those who saw me tearing down one of Australia's great icons. And the problem is that Simpson is more than Simpson the man and Simpson more the Gallipoli. He was a representative of a set of values and behaviours that half the room thought it was so admirable that we should prop him up and accept the fact that he's wrong. And the other half said, no, you should never worship at the altar of myth and look to the evidence. And I'm just a bit concerned that the way history gets used in our society. History is used to sustain those horrible skinheads in Europe in their neo-fascist ways. It's not much different from a lot of ways we use history here to prop up a point of view about, the superiority of the Australian soldier, for example. And that's my big worry. But on the other hand, if you don't have your history, you've got no basis on which to start a conversation about what we ought to be, because we come from somewhere. And military history is a defining component of where we've come from. I mean, it sounds a bit wanky, I'm sorry, but...
Not at all. I think that's a really wonderful way to end the discussion. Gents, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much. We should definitely get together and do it again. It's been really great. So thanks for joining us on Living History.
Pleasure.